Good evening, everyone. Hi, friends in the front. No, don't apologize for being social at our events. We don't need you to apologize for that. I want to welcome everyone to our event tonight, our Common Ground Initiative event on affordability. As many of you know, my name is Megan Radecki. It's my privilege to serve as your director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, and we're thrilled that you have come out for this very timely discussion. I actually want to start with an apology this evening. It has come to my attention that I have done a bad job welcoming our virtual attendees. So to our virtual attendees who are watching from home, I hope you all know if you ever run into a snafu and you can't make it in person, you can always catch a Zoom link right on our website. But for those who are watching from home, hello, we see you. We are so glad that you're part of this, and we're grateful that you continue to support our programming from afar, wherever you are. So with that, to our Hauenstein Center members, to our students, our Cook Leadership Academy students, to the community, and everyone who's here, again, we hope you feel welcome in this space, and we're really glad that you're joining us tonight. Now, as you know, we do a wide variety of programming at the Hauenstein Center. We have our Cook Leadership Academy. We have some students in the audience. You want to raise your hands? Students? Cook Leadership Academy? I was like, come on, folks. These are your future employees, your future interns, your future doctors, lawyers, nurses, environmental scientists. That's part of the programming we do. And then when it comes to our public programming, we do events around history and the presidency and the federal government. And we also have our Common Ground Initiative, which we're so proud of. To remind you all, the whole purpose of this is to present different sides of various subjects, to bring experts to the stage, and to present you all with new information or new arguments or ideas that maybe you have not considered before. You may hear some things tonight that you don't agree with from a policy perspective, and that's just fine. And the whole idea is just that you would challenge your own thinking, so that as you continue coming up with ideas and opinions about how you see the world and how you show up in it, that you would have more information to make those decisions. So I thank you all in advance for your open minds to the conversation that's happening tonight. And certainly if there's anything afterwards you want to talk about, you're welcome to come find me and tell me about it. So tonight we're going to talk about affordability, which I think is top of mind for so many people these days, whether it's the cost of housing or groceries, childcare, transportation. Most people are making considerations in their daily lives about what they're doing from a spending perspective. It's interesting to note that there are actually 41% of Michiganders who are considered ALICE, so that's asset limited, income constrained, or another word, working poor. And of that 41%, or 14% of them fall below the poverty level, and then 27% are in that working poor range. So when we talk about these conversations, we all feel it, but it's a very real situation here in Michigan as we think about how do we move forward together as communities, as a state. It's a very salient issue. Understanding more about how to address affordability is critical as we consider how to show up as ethical and effective leaders in the world. And you know that's our mission here at the Hauenstein Center. So as we get started, we have a fantastic panel, but I'm proud to introduce an ethical and effective leader who is on the rise from our very own Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Gino Gonzalez is going to share their leadership minute and help introduce tonight's panel. And let me tell you a little bit about Gino. Gino Gonzalez is senior at Grand Valley State University, majoring in sociology and minoring in communication and public advocacy and human rights. Their academic interests lie in addressing economic inequality by analyzing societal narratives and systemic disparities. After graduation, they intend to pursue a PhD in sociology to influence public policy and help eradicate poverty. Please join me in welcoming Gino.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing okay. So, when I was a child, between 6, 7 years old, I was a bully. Early on, I had somehow picked up an authoritarian model of leadership. So I ruled through intimidation. I created a culture of fear. It was my way or no way. Of course, this kind of thing is not sustainable. After a long time of ruling through fear, my time had come. One day, as I was playing with the children who I intimidated, they all turned on me and beat me to a pulp. To make sense what happened to me, you can't just look at my behavior. You have to understand that what I did was wrong, what those kids did was wrong, sure. But you can't understand the culture of power grabbing without understanding the culture of poverty. Growing up, it became very clear to me that my parents were struggling. Of course, even then, the dominant narrative was that our circumstances were purely of our own making. We were poor because we did not work hard enough. We were poor because we were not smart enough. We were poor because it was our fault. That's what my developing brain had internalized. Combined with the popular sentiment that only those that gnawed their way towards the top were worthy of ruling, and it's no wonder that I picked up intimidation as a model for leadership. You'd think as I grew up that I would discard this nasty framework, and I did, mostly. As a teenager and into my early adulthood, I had spent years leading my friends Henry and Jared through several projects with various degrees of success. It took some work, but I had shed the need to be the one in full control. These friends who I'd spent years working with became family, my brothers. It looked like after all the years of hard work, our big break was just around the corner. But then Henry got diagnosed with a horribly aggressive form of abdominal cancer. So I dropped everything and I took care of him. And just within a few months, he was gone. Our goals unrealized, I blamed myself. In my grief, the only words that kept looping in my head was, I have failed you, Henry. Maybe if I had let go of my toxic habits sooner, we could have attained our goals. Fast forward a few years, after a long period of grief and guilt, I met the love of my life. I started to read and learn again. I had purpose once more. And a funny thing happened. Whenever we were discussing the problems of the world, something kept popping up. Money, the economy, capitalism. To which I'd usually ask, okay, cool, so what are we going to do about it? And the common reply would be, nothing. It is what it is. It is what it is. Respectfully, nah, that was not good enough for me. So I started my journey in GVSU. I thought in order to help address economic inequality, I would have to learn all the things. History, politics, economics, policies, gather all the data. Except I quickly realized that it would take more to just know things. I would have to find a way to collaborate with people to help implement solutions. I would have to confront the scary thing linked to my grief and my guilt, leadership. So I became the president of the sociology club. I got accepted into the Cook Leadership Program, faced my fear and trepidation involving leadership, realized that of course it would take more than just a Puerto Rican with a PhD to help address economic inequality. Realized that leadership did not have to be this top-down hierarchical structure. Realized that leadership belongs to all of us. If we want to stand any chance in creating a more equitable economic world, we need more leaders. And I'd argue we need more kind leaders. People who understand that behind the numbers of economics are individuals whose humanity must be recognized and cherished. So, I can finally say, with comfort, that my name is Gino Gonzalez, and I am a leader. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers with a brief biography. For more details about our guests, please check your program. Emily G. is the Senior Vice President for Economic Policy and a Senior Fellow for Health Policy at the Center for American Progress. Emily previously served on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama White House. Michelle Miller Adams is a senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Michelle co-directs the Upjohn Institute's Policy for Place initiative that explores how communities can create good jobs for their residents. David Hebert is a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. He has also been a fellow with the U.S. Senate Committee on the Budget and has worked for the U.S. Joint Economic Committee. Please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage.
So, quite frankly, we're going to start with the question of yes or no. I mean, these are three accomplished economists. Yes or no, are we in an affordability crisis? Hold your commentary, simply yes or no, and Emily, we'll start with you.
I'm a yes.
I am also a yes.
Man. Maybe.
Oh.
Yes, yes, or maybe. So that's how we want to start our conversation tonight and set the table from here on out. So we hear affordability referenced everywhere now, right? From groceries and housing to college and healthcare. How do each of you define affordability in the context of the American economy today? And why does that definition matter for policy debates? And again, Emily, I'm going to start with you here.
Sure. So I would have defined affordability as having the means to obtain the things you need for basic living. So I'm particularly thinking about things like housing, food, healthcare, basic cost of living.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that definition, being able to meet your basic needs, that of your family, at not just the most basic level, but to have a decent standard of living. I mean, historically, we've looked at having a standard of living that is at least as good as the generation that came before us, and having enough money, whether that comes from wages or whatever else, to support a decent standard of living, a rising standard of living over time.
Yeah, I have no problem with either of those definitions. The challenge that I see is whether the challenges that we all face rises to the occasion of a crisis. On that front, certainly we want to make sure that people live a dignified human existence. We certainly want to recognize the need, the material need for food, shelter, housing, anything like that. But the challenge is, of course, meeting those needs and making sure that we are using policy to the best of our ability to do so.
So there's a lot of terms that get thrown about, or people talk about inputs to what is causing the affordability crisis. If you could redirect the national conversation toward one issue or assumption, what would it be? And why hasn't it gotten more attention? And Michelle, I'll let you start with this one.
Okay, so when we talk about affordability, we tend to focus on prices, on what things cost, and whether that's something you encounter daily at the grocery store, at the gas station, or monthly when you pay your electricity bill, or annually when you buy your insurance, or when you try to go to college. I don't think there's enough attention to the other side of the equation, which is wages and how much people are earning. So we have a problem of prices that are unaffordable, but sitting alongside that, and part of the reason for that is that we have a problem of wages that have stagnated over the past about 45 years and have failed to keep pace. So that's how I would reorient the conversation.
Sure. Other thoughts?
I would say I think the affordability crisis for the working class deserves special attention. I mean, as shown by the hands here, I think there's sort of broad shared frustration with rising prices, particularly for healthcare, for utilities, for food. But I worry a lot about, particularly wages increasing and wealth increasing for the lowest paid Americans. I think we're a very wealthy country, but we've seen an increase in inequality. And I think we're also going to see affordability get worse in the coming years, not better, particularly for food and for low-income people who need Medicaid and healthcare because of cuts in Trump's so-called One Big Beautiful Bill.
So I would reframe the national conversation to be a local conversation. To me, Washington, D.C. is comprised of 537 people. That's 435 representatives, 100 senators, a vice president, and a president. Those 537 people are never going to know you or West Michigan or wherever you're from the way you do. And so what I would say is that rather than turning to Washington, which, as my colleague and I have explored, has what we call a reverse Midas touch when it comes to solving problems, I would instead turn us toward local solutions. Look at what happened last fall when SNAP benefits ran out. Rather than see millions of people starving, local communities stepped up. And I think there's a tremendous scope. It won't solve every problem, I will never claim that, but there's tremendous scope for local and state governments to fill the gaps in a more meaningful way that honors the dignity of the people in which they serve.
Thanks for that. So let's redirect conversation a little bit to just, impacts on Americans. So we often hear strong macroeconomic indicators such as GDP growth, low unemployment, and stock market gains alongside persistent affordability concerns. How do you explain that disconnect, and what does it reveal about how we measure economic success? And Dave, maybe you start with this one.
Yeah, so gross domestic product is a fascinating variable that we've created out of almost nothing. It was created by a guy named Simon Kuznets back in the early 1900s. And as the father of gross domestic product, Simon warned us not to use it as a measure of overall well-being in any sense of the word, okay? It has become exactly that. The truth of the matter is that people do not eat GDP growth rates. How many of you saw that 4.3% GDP growth in third quarter last year and said, my God, there's 4.3% more food on my table? How many of you found your rent or your mortgages to be 4.3% more affordable? How many of you found that it costs 4.3% less for you to fill your gas tank? My answer, or my guess, is none of you. And the reason is precisely because gross domestic product does not measure overall well-being. It was never intended to do that. So we do need more robust measurements. We need different ones. We need to understand each other. And that's why the local is so important. You understand how your job market is doing. You understand that 100,000 tech jobs in Tennessee and California means nothing to you in Michigan. What matters is how you are doing and how your community is doing. And that's why the primacy in our system, or at least what it's supposed to be, is at the local level. The federal government should do basically nothing. Their reverse Midas touch has caused more harm than good. But we need to have solutions, and those solutions come from us at the local and state level.
Go ahead. I guess I would like to jump into our common ground here and disagree with the last part of what you said about how the federal government should do nothing, can do nothing. I am a big believer in state and local action, and I think there's a lot of room for bipartisanship at the state and local level. However, the reality is that a lot of the money underpinning those efforts either comes or doesn't come from the federal government. A lot of what the state does is allocate federal dollars, and Emily referenced the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is going to, over a period of time, cut $1 billion out of Medicaid. It's not the federal government that's coming in and cutting our Medicaid. The states are going to need to be doing that. So what states can do is constrained and limited by flows of income that come from the federal government. And so that's why taxing and budgets and tax cuts and who they're going to, that's why those things matter.
I would also add that states and localities are constrained in a way that the federal government isn't. The federal government can borrow money through treasury bonds, and lots of states are constrained by balanced budget laws, don't have the deep pockets the federal government does. And so particularly in bad times, say like a pandemic crisis or a recession, federal counter-cyclical programs that help people keep food on the table, that ensure that they can still see a doctor, that help them get, keep paying the bills when they don't have a job, are really important to digging the economy out of a recession and making sure that people's basic needs are met.
And I want to add one more thing about the SNAP example you gave. That was a beautiful thing, watching neighbors help neighbors and donations to food banks go up, but no one believed for a minute that that volunteer effort could replace the SNAP program. It was a all hands on deck, short-term push that probably sanded the rough edges off, but there are real limits on the voluntary sector and the philanthropic sector. Grand Rapids is an incredibly philanthropic place, but when you want to build big stuff here, you need the public money coming in to help do it.
I guess let me clarify a little bit, just so I'm not painting myself into a corner and misrepresenting what I intend to say. My claim is not that the federal government can and should do literally nothing. My claim is that on the issue of affordability, the federal government is far less capable and operates at far more expense for far less output or satisfaction than state and local governments can. Obviously, during a pandemic that's affecting the entire nation, there will need to be something at that level. It should be led by the states, understanding, their particular needs, and there should be guidelines in place. But my point here is to say that if you are trying to feed people, for example, state and local governments are going to be far more effective at that, which is why, as you point out, the federal money flows to the state governments who then disperse it. But that creates dependency on the federal government. And as we've seen, when you have a capricious president who can turn that spigot off at will, that's going to create serious problems. The challenge here is not to say that the federal government should do nothing, and I apologize for making that remark. My point here is to say that we should be self-sufficient in the sense that our philanthropic efforts at home should be at home and should be led at home and should be created at home.
So we've talked a little bit about, GDP, we've talked a little bit about what some of the indicators are, but maybe let's back up and say, is it true that everything costs more than it used to? I mean, we were having a conversation at lunch. I was laughing. When I was a kid, I used to babysit for like $3 or $4 an hour, right? And now I have to pay babysitters like $15 to $20 an hour. And I think, whoa, this is different, right? The cost of things is changing. So is it actually true that everything is more expensive? Does it just feel that way? Folks in the audience obviously think it feels that way, but give us some data around is that the case?
So in normal terms, yes, prices do rise over time. So, we are not buying 25-cent gallons of milk. College tuition costs a lot more than it used to. But what I think is particularly relevant for this conversation and this moment we are in is that in the post-pandemic period, we went through a phase of really high inflation, 9% inflation, which is something that hadn't been seen in recent decades. And particularly for food, whereas for the previous 40 years, you had 2 to 3% grocery inflation. You saw a much higher level in that post-pandemic time because of shocks like Russia's war in Ukraine, because of supply chain snafus. Until Friday, we had tariffs on things like bananas and imported beef and other things. And so, not only did prices rise at a much faster rate than people were used to, you also had a period where prices were rising above wages. And that's where I think people really feel squeezed, is that that dollar that you earn isn't going as far as it used to. So we've seen things like rent rise about 35% since the pandemic, groceries up about 30% since January 2020. And so, it's no wonder the majority of Americans feel like they are worried about grocery prices, utility prices, and feel like things like housing and healthcare are unaffordable.
And I think, I don't like it when a bunch of academics get together and say it's complicated, but it is complicated because there's inflation, but then there are other things contributing to rising prices as well. So there are whole sectors of the economy where price increases have far outpaced inflation, including housing, healthcare, college tuition. And in each of those cases, there are a whole set of reasons. Supply and demand, a big part of it. And I absolutely agree with Dave that a lot of things in the US really are done and should be done at the state and local level. You don't need the federal government to come in and tell you how to resolve your housing price problem here, your rental costs in Grand Rapids. You need to figure out local ways to build more housing. And similarly, college tuition is something that varies from institution to institution and state to state. but contributing to the rise in tuition prices are cutbacks in state aid. There are a lot of things going on behind these really high price increases that are not just inflation, just kind of built into the economy. There are special bottlenecks and supply and demand problems that are making these things more expensive and unaffordable. I always use the example of when I was in college in the 1970s in California. If you, oh, sorry, you can't hear me? Oh, I'm so sorry. I guess I'll use this. My college tuition adjusted in inflation for today would probably be about $3,000 a year, when in reality, the University of California, where I went to college, charges tuition of about $15,000 or $16,000 a year. So that's not an inflationary increase. There's something else going on there.
So I can shed light on the something else going on there. So my esteemed co-panelist mentioned housing, education, and healthcare. So I took a little trip through the Federal Registry this morning just to see what was in there. Anyone want to guess what the top 3 largest entries in the Federal Registry? And for some context, the Federal Registry is the list of all the rules, regulations, taxes, etc. that industries have to abide by. Anyone want to guess what the top 3 most common things in that registry are? Top 3 industries? Those 3. The reason why is because we've tried for so long to make these things more affordable by shoveling federal dollars into them. Those federal dollars, by the way, come from states. What I would argue is that by putting more and more money into those institutions and not creating the space for people to build to match the increased spending, is that the inevitable result is that price has to rise. Not that prices should rise. They have to. They can't not. And so what happens is that if you qualify for programs that make these things more affordable to you, that's great. You're using federal tax dollars to help your purchase. But if you don't, and what we're finding is that administrations vary on who qualifies and who doesn't. If you do not qualify for those things, guess what? You get to pay the unsubsidized, much higher price. That's pushing people out of these spaces. So what I'm arguing here is that rather than send dollars to the federal government, only for them to then send them back to the states and tell us how we should spend them, I would say keep it here and get regulations out of the way that are preventing people from meeting the needs of the people in their community. Right now, if you look at healthcare, prior to the Affordable Care Act, we were hiring at about 2% rate for physicians or medical providers. After the Affordable Care Act, which essentially doubled healthcare spending in this country, we're still hiring at about 2%. The American Medical Association estimates that we're tens of thousands of doctors short right now, and it will grow to about 60 to 80,000 physicians short by 2036. All that money is not creating more doctors. What it is creating is a bloated bureaucracy that requires physicians to spend upwards of half their time, if not more, on recording what they did, on charting. My wife is a surgeon. She sees 25 patients a day. She's up until 2 o'clock in the morning recording what she did every day. That's paperwork. You're telling me that someone went to medical school to learn how to fill out paperwork? I thought they went to medical school to help people, to be a doctor. But that's not what our system does today. And that's not what happens when federal government dollars get involved. They create the bureaucracy. They create the need to demonstrate that you are complying with the rules that come out of Washington, D.C., which means that the employment in those sectors reflects that. Medical coding is the fastest growing industry in the medical field right now, not physicians. That's a problem.
So I'd like to make a comment on that, because I think you're conflating 2 things,
Sure.
sort of one, the government subsidies and government intervention with, what are some real problems, I think, in healthcare about barriers to practice, services that could be performed in a lower intensity setting or by someone who's not an MD, but could be a nurse practicing to the top of their license, or a pharmacist.
Yeah.
What the Affordable Care Act did, just to take one example of regulation I think was sorely needed, that helped get millions of people who didn't previously have health insurance covered. The uninsurance rate dropped from about 15 or 16% down to below 10%. It was the lowest in history, because people could finally get coverage for basic things. So you could show up at an emergency room and actually have coverage. And I think society owes people a baseline amount of healthcare coverage so they can buy insulin if they have diabetes, so they can access a doctor when they're sick or their kid is sick. If you look at the Medicare program, there are two sort of flavors of Medicare. One, traditional Medicare, which is essentially the federal government-run program. And then there's Medicare Advantage, which is run by private firms. And I think there's an example of where you have a lot more waste in the private Medicare Advantage program. You have what Dave's talking about, upcoding by firms where doctors are essentially paid and insurance companies are paid to make people look sicker than they are. But a lot less administrative waste in the traditional Medicare program where the government sets the prices. And it's a much more simple program where people actually have better access to doctor networks.
So let me just clarify one thing real quick. I have no problem with people having health insurance. But here's the thing. If I have the greatest health insurance on the planet and I'm on a desert island by myself and I break my leg, there's no one for me to see. Insurance is not the same thing as care. You can have great insurance, but if there are not doctors to provide the service that insurance is supposed to pay for, which I agree, I think, with you that health insurance companies have done a lot to preclude people from getting access to health care. My point is not about the paying for it. Health insurance is great if you can get to a doctor, if there's a doctor for you to see. And in a world where we're short tens of thousands of doctors, increasing insurance rates is great. I have no problem with that. But that's shoveling more money at health care without increasing the ability of people to see it.
I'm a little concerned about something you said about really keeping the tax dollars local and at the state level. The United States has vastly different areas and wealth from state to state, and we're a federal system where basically everybody pays in, and the reality is the richer states are subsidizing the poorer states. That's what makes us a nation, whether that's through social safety net spending or disaster aid. But a truly kind of hyper-local approach basically says, all right, you're going to have like a super rich Massachusetts and a really, really poor Mississippi, and that's okay. And so that's kind of, one of the big things the federal government does is bring money in and send money back out in a way that helps create a not quite equal, but a roughly equal standard of living across different parts of the state.
Well,
So I would say, look, I'm not arguing that we go to zero taxes dollars going to the federal government. And I know you're not saying that, but I want to clarify it. But at a point where states are receiving, on average, a third of their annual budgets from the federal government, I think we could drop that down to a tenth or some other number that's less than a third. Make them less dependent on federal tax dollars. Cut out the middleman. I don't know how you feel about middlemen in the society, but we could cut out the middlemen and save a whole bunch of money, because here's the thing. People in Washington, D.C. who are redistributing those dollars, they don't work for free.
I don't like middlemen, but I also want to be clear that what you're saying is people are still going to pay the same level of taxes. They're
Yes.
just going to pay it to the state government. And in states where people are willing to pay more taxes, they're going to get more services. And where they aren't willing to pay taxes, they're going to get fewer services. And that is one possibility. But I feel like we've gotten a little off the affordability topic.
it's okay. It's
So,
all right.
yeah.
No. Again, I think this is a great illustration of how complex these issues are, right? And
It's so complicated.
if you're a systems person,
Yeah.
it's really hard because we think, okay, how are we going to solve affordability? We're going to make things more affordable for people.
Right.
Well, how do we do that? Well, we have to look at federal policy, and then we also have to think about wage attainment, and then we have to think about education, and then we have to think about food programs. And this is why we have those conversations, because it's so much more complex.
And we do have to think about things like the cost of too much medical coding. So, it gets to the very low level.
Yeah. So to your point, Michelle, let's shift gears a little bit. We know that economic affordability is a perennial political issue. And I will say that all of these individuals represent nonpartisan centers. However, I'm sure they still have some thoughts about this. As we think about going to the polls, and we're going to hear people campaigning to us and promising us things and telling us certain things, to what extent is today's economic environment a result of long-term structural shifts as opposed to recent economic policy decisions? And Michelle, I see you nodding. Why don't you start us?
I'm nodding at Emily.
Okay, I'm happy to go first. So I think a number of these problems are long-standing structural problems often where we actually, to our earlier points, we do need supply increases. So the supply of physicians and healthcare, I think would or not just physicians, but all medical providers would help alleviate some of the cost issues and some of the competition issues. Housing is another one where sort of local zoning regulations often mean that we can't build as densely or as efficiently as we could. And I think there's a role definitely for local and state policy, and maybe for federal policy too, to incentivize bringing down some of those barriers and building more and building more inexpensively. I think, and then on other things like utilities, there's how utilities companies are run. I think there are also more recent things like the repeal of tax credits and subsidies to help try to build clean energy are having a real effect. People will pay about $100 more in utility bills this year because that clean energy is not coming online. So I think it's a combination of both things, of recent decisions around food and healthcare funding and utilities funding, but also long-seated things. And I think the solution similarly will be need to address those immediate needs that people have, helping people make sure they can make ends meet, that they have healthcare tomorrow, that they have food on the table, but also making longer-term investments in fixing some of these structural problems and making investments for down the road.
So what I would say is, as you go to the polls and think about these issues, I would emphasize the supply side here. Now, this is not me doing some Reagan supply side economics, trickle down theory. This is saying that if you make it and you make it easier for people to produce those things, the price is going to come down. And as an added bonus, the jobs will still be there. What I see out of Washington, however, and I say this with all due respect to Emily, is a lot of times people will say things like, oh yeah, we need to increase affordability, we need to drive innovation and make things easier to build, right? Build, baby, build. President Obama in 2014, speaking to the governors, said we need to get onerous regulations out of housing. So this isn't, the fact that housing construction is overregulated is a bipartisan issue. But a lot of people will say that we need to pass some stimulus package or some aid package to help people in the transition until those new houses come online. It'll be temporary. We'll just help them for now. The unfortunate reality is that those temporary assistance programs very quickly become permanent assistance programs. Look at the ACA and the debate behind the subsidies that expired at the beginning of this year. Those were enacted because of COVID to help people during a genuine health crisis, which I have no issue with. When there is a national problem of that magnitude, sure, throw some money at it, solve the problem. I'm with you. But it has become something that people are dependent upon. And now, if we don't extend those tax credits, if we don't extend those subsidies, millions of people will lose their health insurance. This wasn't a temporary fix. It was temporary in name only. It has become permanent. And the long history of the US temporary fixes is that they become permanent, which creates the dependency, which creates the problem. And what I'm suggesting here is that the local governments are more likely to cede that power back to you, to stop taxing you for these temporary things, and to let you keep the money that you earned and solve the problem that way. Washington is going to institutionalize them. We see this with the deficit. Look at what happened to federal spending in COVID. $2 trillion of extra spending over those COVID years. It was temporary, we're told. Anyone watch the CBO or any budget releases? Has the federal budget come down? Not at all.
But to be fair, Dave, it's shifted, right? Those huge expenditures during the COVID and post-COVID era were, as far as I remember, checks that came to me. The federal deficit right now is rising because of the projected rise because of the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is massive tax cuts for billionaires and an end to subsidies for middle income people who are trying to get health insurance. So, there's a distributional question in there that you kind of have to think about. I do want to answer Megan's question about what you should think about when you're approached by politicians over this year, as you certainly will be. If anybody tells you they're going to take prices back to where they were before the pandemic, we all agree that's a bad thing. That means disinflation. Disinflation means we're in a recession and people are going to be losing jobs and wages are going to be going down. So don't buy those promises. Also, I would say I really do agree with you that a lot of solutions to these supply and demand questions are at the local level. If you're serious about wanting rental prices to come down in Grand Rapids, you should be voting for people who are going to pursue zoning changes and more building. And I would also strongly suggest that you follow the evidence. There's a lot of evidence that says, I don't love this, but I believe it. Rent control doesn't work, but taking restrictive zoning off does when it comes to getting more building. There's a large body of research that says that. And so if someone comes along and says rents are too high, let's have rent control, you should be empowered to say research shows that rent control doesn't lead to more building or lead for prices to come down, except for those people who have the rent control departments who are very lucky. So yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you. So let's shift a little bit to the solution side of things. Where can we find opportunities to speak into these matters, to show up as ethical and effective leaders? What should the folks in the audience be advocating for? What information should they be looking for as they decide to, how they're going to show up in the world and think about affordability and act on it?
I have a really specific example from here in Michigan. So the students in the room might have heard, some of the parents might have heard, we have tuition-free community college in Michigan. And that's awesome because that takes a lot of the mystery out of what it costs to go to college and says you can go to college without paying tuition. There's a big problem with that program. The big problem is you only get that tuition-free community college if you attend full-time. I think all the students in this room are probably working and probably know how hard it is. Extra hard for low-income students who are parents. So this is something that was just built into the legislation, and it was, in my opinion, a mistake. I don't know how intentional it was, but you can advocate for changes to that law that allows students to use the tuition-free community college guarantee if they're going half-time, which you need to be able to get your Pell Grants. So that's just one example.
Other thoughts about where we show up in this?
I will say beware of promises for affordability that actually sort of pull the rug out from under people or that erode the value of something. I think when there are some examples in healthcare of proposed plans that would, supposedly give people more skin in the game or more choice by offering really high deductibles or transferring money over to a savings account instead of insurance. Those can be misleading because if you're a healthy person, you might not have a lot of spending or you might think you're going to be healthy for the year. But really what they do in practice is saddle people with enormous expenses when they do have a car accident or suddenly get ill. And it's, instead of spreading that cost over time or across the population, end up saddling people who are sick or misfortunate with a lot of the costs. And so, those plans don't provide the kind of financial protection that comprehensive health insurance does.
So for me, the big issue is always supply, right? Is this person that's seeking your vote going to help people build and serve one another? If the answer to that question is yes, you should think seriously about whether they're sincere, right? Not that they're nefarious or anything like that. If instead what they're saying is, I want to help you buy this thing, that's not solving the problem. We should be helping people create. That includes all of you. You're all creative people. You all have dignity. You can all do something to help your fellow person. And what I would look for is making it easier for us to help one another. Through commercial activity, sure. Through philanthropy, maybe. Through whatever it is that you find the best way to help. If this person is sincerely about trying to make things more affordable, they'll be sincere about trying to make it easier to create and easier to provide.
So one of the things we talk about a lot with this group is where do I go to find more information? Who can I trust? Which articles, which news sources? Can we talk a little bit about that as these folks go out and try to figure out, where do I get the most accurate information about what's going on with the economy? Where can folks start?
We had a little conversation about this in our pre-meeting, and we all agree that you got to stick with the fact-based media, right? Do not get your news from TikTok unless that TikTok is about an article that is in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. So make sure that you know what you're watching. Make sure that you know what you're reading, where it comes from. Be suspicious, especially in this day and age of AI just doing so many things so well. Make sure that your source is a reliable source, so they do the checking for you. Major media organizations, you can use those fact check sites. You can read something online and go, that sounds really interesting. Let's find out if it's true. Let's go to one of those. What are some examples of those?
Snopes.
Yeah, Snopes, right?
PolitiFact is the one that does a lot of myth
PolitiFact,
busting.
exactly. So other ideas.
So I said this at the lunch meeting today, and for those of you that were there, I apologize, you're going to hear it again. BLS.gov, BEA.gov, they are wonderfully accurate. They are under attack right now by someone who thinks they are not. But let me give you some quick statistics on this. Right now, there are 157 million jobs in the United States. When you're off by 800,000, you are off by 0.5%. That's a .995 batting average for those baseball fans as we enter spring training season. Pretty sure that's Hall of Fame numbers, but maybe I'm wrong. The other thing to consider is that every month, something like 6.1 million jobs are destroyed, and 6.1 million jobs are created. So to be off by 800,000 when you have a flow of 6 million per month in each direction, so it's actually a 12 million job flow, is a really impressive thing. And here's the other secret. The BLS and the BEA, they publish their reports as one page. They're very easy to read. You don't need a PhD in economics. You don't even need to go to college to read these. They're actually remarkably simple. You might need to have some training to understand what they mean. So what the unemployment rate, for example, is actually measuring. You might want to look that up. But to see what the number is, and to see the breakdown by sector, by region, by educational attainment, race, gender, whatever statistic you want, it's all right there in black and white, and you can see it. You don't need to get this information from Fox, CNN, MSNBC. You can go straight to the source.
And I really like the census quick fact site.
Yeah.
We're all in agreement. You can trust government statistics.
Yes.
Census.gov, quickfacts.census.gov. You can look up all kinds of things about your county, your city, your state right there.
And I will, in the spirit of common ground, I will agree with both Michelle and Dave too, that federal government data is reliable. It's also really, really important. And because the federal government has authorities to collect information that others can't, to get information from businesses on investment, on employment, to get information from us as citizens as part of the census. The government is held accountable for making sure that is done in a way that is accurate, for making the information and the methodology transparent. I've seen some, particularly during the government shutdown when the BLS was shut down, some ideas that, there are these private surveys that have information on layoffs or on jobs numbers. Private information is no substitute for federal government federal collections, because they don't have this access to the same sort of information. And in fact, a lot of the private surveys rely on census baselines or other information to come up with the statistics. So I think it's really important to go to those primary sources, but also to make sure that they are adequately funded and resourced to keep providing that information.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to be moving into audience Q&A soon, so get your questions ready. But prior to doing that, I thought it would come up by now, and it hasn't. So I'm just going to ask the question, but let's sort of reverse a little bit and talk about tariffs.
Oh, fun.
It's obviously a hot topic. The Supreme Court put out a ruling about it last week, but for the folks in the room who need to know, what should I think about tariffs? Would love some opinions on that.
Sure, I see everyone looking at me. So the fun story behind this. So when I joined AIER a year and a half ago, Sam Gregg, our president, told me he was looking for someone to write about tariffs. And I said, well, that's dumb. Everyone agrees. Horrible. Okay. And there aren't any anymore. Yeah, and there aren't anymore, and they're all low, and they're never going to go up because no one would be that stupid. And he laughed, and I said, I think, Dave, it's going to be a bigger issue. A year and a half later, here I am. I think I'm at something like 100 popular articles on the topic. So it's been fun. Really, really fun. So here's the thing. A 2021 American Economics Association survey. So the American Economics Association is by far and away the most prestigious association for economics that there is in the world, right? It's not because, America, it's just that's where everyone goes. They surveyed economists there and asked, tariffs, yay or nay, destructive or not. 95% of economists agreed that they are destructive. Now here's the thing. If you look at economists, like the jokes about economic consensus write themselves. Okay, my favorite is that economic consensus is kind of like being a married bachelor. Contradiction of terms, okay? When we are united, 95% versus 5, right? It's a remarkable achievement. That should tell you something. The issue that I see is that the 5% of economists that were in disagreement all work at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue today, okay? Here's the problem with tariffs. Back in the 19th century, so the 1800s, when trade was mostly about final goods, when what we were buying from other countries were things that you and I would purchase off the shelves, a case, thin though it is, could be made that tariffs would be helpful for the local economy in some capacity, okay? Today, something like 65%, upwards, maybe even 70% of what's on those ships are raw materials and intermediate goods. Basically car components or automotive components, things of that nature. Things that American manufacturers use to do the advanced manufacturing that we do, that we specialize in. Now, a lot of people focus on China and point out that they produce more stuff than we do. It's true. They produce somewhere between 60 and 100% more stuff than we do. Let's say they produce double. Anyone have an idea of how many people there are working in manufacturing in China right now? Want to take a guess? It's 212.7 million people. Now, I told you earlier there are 157 million people working in the United States. In other words, China employs more people in manufacturing alone than the US employs people. Do you have any idea how many people work in manufacturing in the US? It's 12.7 million. Or one American manufacturing worker is as productive as 16 workers in China. So, who needs the protection? Us or them? I submit to you that if anyone in the world needs protection in the manufacturing sector, it ain't us. We dominate on a per capita basis, the likes of which has never been seen. Now, maybe I'm weird. I believe in the American people. I don't think they need to be protected from the rest of the world. I think we would win in a straight up, battle, if you will. Even if we have unfair trade practices out of other countries, we are 16 times more productive on a per capita basis than the next highest producing country in the world. That's how dominant we are. So what I would say is that rather than tariff making manufacturing more expensive for the American people, we should be unleashing our workers on the rest of the world. That will create jobs, it will create income, it will lower prices, it will make things cheaper for everyone across the entire economy. All you have to do is believe in America. Call me crazy.
So I'll agree that the Trump administration tariff policy was just bonkers. Number one, it was illegal. But even if you, if you were to set that aside for a moment, it just doesn't make sense to tariff things that we can never hope to make here. Tariffs are basically a tax that you could use for national security reasons, for sort of unfair trade practices reasons, but we're never going to grow bananas or coffee in West Michigan. And so it doesn't really make sense to raise costs on Americans. And this is an anti-affordability policy, to be frank. So Americans paid about $1,000 more last year because of Trump's tariffs. The rates were also just being changed willy-nilly, and so there wasn't really an economic reason to do this. In fact, the U.S. lost manufacturing jobs last year.
And there were also some really negative, very local consequences here in West Michigan. This isn't a politically targeted policy, unlike some of the other Trump administration policies designed to hurt certain states. All parts of the country lost employers. We lost employers here in West Michigan who just could not continue to function successfully now that their intermediate goods and primary goods coming in were subject to tariffs. So we saw businesses close. We saw fire sales of beautiful clocks. Some of you know what I'm talking about. And we saw people lose their jobs as those businesses closed. Business, above all, hates unpredictability. And the tariff journey has been sort of the essence of unpredictability. And it still is. So that will be interesting to watch.
Let me give you my favorite local example as well. So, Beer City, USA? Yeah. Anyone here enjoy craft beer? Anyone here notice that maybe 10 years ago the cans all got a little bit taller and there were 4 packs of cans instead of 6 packs of cans? Let's put a pin in that for a second. So the 2018 Trump tariffs on aluminum and steel are estimated to have saved about 1,000 jobs in the aluminum producing sector nationwide. They're also estimated to have cost about 75,000 jobs in manufacturing due to the higher price of aluminum. But here's the kicker. Why do we suddenly see taller cans of beer in Grand Rapids and around the country? Where is most of the aluminum in the can? It's in the top and bottom. There's almost none in the sides. So here's the trick. If I can sell you the same volume of beer in 4 cans instead of 6, I can cut my aluminum costs by about 50%. What happens when I purchase 50% less aluminum, which, just for the record, canning is the #1 purchaser of aluminum in the US. When the canning industry cuts their consumption of aluminum by about 50%, what do you think happens to jobs in the aluminum sector? Can you fire a machine? No, but I can fire a worker. So those 1,000 jobs that were saved in 2018, they're gone. So this is the long-term effect of tariffs. Maybe in the short run, they create a couple jobs here and there. They destroy jobs in the short run too, but in the long run, they just destroy the jobs. And we get stuck with taller cans instead of shorter ones.
That's a great story. Thanks for that.
Did not know that.
Okay, now it's the audience's turn to share some questions, some wonderings with the panelists. Christine has a roving microphone, and I think we have a question right there to your right.
So I grew up in West Michigan, and many of the growing communities in West Michigan are focused on building homes that make a profit. And I know you guys talked about affordable housing, but where should we build the affordable housing if no communities want to build it?
I'm going to talk about Minneapolis for a moment. Minneapolis, very blue city, but high cost of living, high cost of rental. Minneapolis made a major change to its zoning a couple of years ago. They basically took off all the zoning that said only single family homes can be built here. And they basically said, build whatever you want, wherever you want in the city. And they also changed some zoning rules. They changed some rules about how many parking spaces places needed to have that were being built. So you started seeing duplexes and triplexes and maybe some, sort of low-rise multifamily housing going in where previously single homes would have been built. St. Paul went all in on rent control. They have not seen any new building, and they have not seen their rental prices fall, whereas Minneapolis has. So we have a lot of land in Michigan. You can build out. Of course, that has to be measured against the costs of sprawl, the environmental costs of sprawl. I personally think that for cities, density is an asset. Walkability is an asset. We've seen the infill of the middle of Grand Rapids here become a very, very desirable place. And there are many parts of Grand Rapids where building multi-units could happen. That's not true in every city. I mean, that's certainly not true in New York. And New York is seeing things like unoccupied office buildings being converted into condos or co-ops. So it's going to look different. Housing is a field where you really need to have a strategy that's appropriate to the local community.
I think there's a question of where should you build? And so I would give a similar answer. I think near where people want to work is good. Dense housing zones near transit corridors is also good for environmental reasons, but also quality of life reasons, and be able to sustain the density that has shops and workplaces near housing. Where can you build and where will you be allowed to build, I think is the more complicated political economy question, because we know in the long run, if we are able to close that 2 million plus supply gap the US has, that rents will go up more slowly, or housing prices will go up more slowly. Housing will be more affordable, but that is a long run game. And in the short run, communities often face a lot of opposition to new building. So one proposal that my organization, Center for American Progress, has is, could you create some sort of short-run incentive that would help local high-cost areas lower the rent for people in exchange for some reforms to permitting, some reforms to zoning that would enable and unlock communities to build denser in areas so that you could increase that supply for the long run, which would sort of change that political calculus, giving people some relief on rent in order to make those long run investments in greater supply.
So I would agree with everything they've said. Density is certainly not the enemy of progress. But I would also add one more thing. So how many of you have been to the Allendale campus ever? Yeah. You ever notice anything on the side of the road when you're driving out there called empty land? There's a lot of it. And it's all right there along the highway. Now, I'm not saying build a house right next to the highway, but if you put something somewhere between here and Allendale, land's probably pretty cheap. There's a highway right there. They'll bring you right downtown. Right? I used to work up at Ferris State University and commute from here. Seems tenable, right? But that gets into the zoning issues that my co-panelists here have brought up. You need to be allowed to build. And that, to me, is the heart of the issue. People are not allowed to build housing in this country. It's incredibly difficult. In fact, it's so difficult that it's oftentimes more expensive to build the housing that people call affordable, those 1,500 square foot bungalows that people used to love in the 50s and 60s, right? Those are oftentimes more expensive to build than a 2,000 square foot house. Why? Because it's expensive to get the permits.
I believe the consensus of economists, though, is that any building is good. If you are building luxury condos, people are going to move into those luxury condos, and that's going to leave a vacant apartment that someone else is going to be able to move into. So it's really all about supply, and I don't think you have to pick kind of one strategy or another. It's kind of like we should be building everything we can everywhere we can with respect for the environment. I mean, this is where it always gets really tricky, right? And you know, sometimes a lot of people who are complaining about the cost of housing don't want more housing built in their neighborhood. So that's something we can do as individuals, is think about, you know, where do we really stand on housing prices? Do we want to preserve our single family home neighborhood, or do we want to let some duplexes come in because that might lower the price of housing?
Next question.
The panel has discussed regulatory and fiscal measures that have impacted affordability, but I'm wondering if the panel would be able to speak to monetary policy and its impact on affordability in different categories.
Sure, let me take a stab at it. So one of the issues with the monetary authority in the US, the Federal Reserve, is they've taken on quite a bit more responsibility and quite a few more obligations, shall we say, than they were given. So the Federal Reserve was established in 1913 with a dual mandate to basically combat inflation and to promote full employment. Okay. Now here's an interesting tidbit for you. In the 100 years prior to the Fed, so from 1813 to 1913, anyone want to take a guess what the overall inflation rate was during that period? From 1813 to 1913. Take a wild, someone shout out a number and I'll tell you if it's higher or lower. Okay, so higher than that.
Thank you, Bill.
It was lower. It was 8%. Okay, so prices increased by 8% from 1813 to 1913. Okay, that includes, by the way, the Industrial Revolution. Now, from 1913 to 2013, the next 100 years, what was the inflation rate between those 2 years, those two periods? A lot more than that. 2,000%. Okay, so here's my question to you. How's the Federal Reserve doing at accomplishing its goal of preventing or limiting inflation? What grade would you give it? Would you give it a C- so you don't have to see it next semester? Okay, so to me, when the Federal Reserve can't even succeed at the one job it has, one of the two jobs it has, frankly, right? If it can't even succeed at that, the idea that we can use quantitative easing, easy money, printing things to accomplish any other factor or function in society is laughable. This is like the intern who can't pour your coffee right, telling you that they're going to revolutionize your supply chain. It's like, no, you're not. Learn how to pour the coffee first. Let's start small. Okay? So what I see out of the Fed is the creation of cheap and easy money. They're just printing money left, right, and center and enabling Congress to continue spending, which is enabling further that reverse Midas touch that I was talking about earlier.
What effect would 15 million people coming into the country unplanned, that would create demand, I think, without increasing the supply at all? What effect does that have on housing costs?
So 15 million people would be 10% of the entire workforce, right? So not a whole lot. I mean, it's certainly not nothing. I think what we found is that through the, shall we say, creative removal of immigrants from this country, the estimate is that rental prices will come down by something like 2%, which, cool. Show me a budget that's, off by 2%, right? You're like, oh man, I'm so close. Just that extra 2%. That's going to be the difference that makes the difference in my life. So I'm skeptical of, blaming immigrants on anything, legal or otherwise, right? Frankly, the number is just not big enough to have a massive effect on wages. In fact, what we find instead is that when we have more immigration, wages tend to rise. It enables more productivity. Now, sure, I'm not going to claim that everyone's wages rise. There certainly are Americans who are displaced. But what we find on net is that the overwhelming majority of Americans, and by overwhelming, I mean far more than 90% of Americans, their wages go up, not down. We also find new opportunities. Whenever you bring more people in, it enables more production, right? Production is a function of how many people you have and how much capital you have.
Technology.
Yeah, that's capital,
Yeah.
right? We economists are very lazy. We're like, there's two
things,
variables,
labor,
right? And you're
capital,
like third, like, no, that's capital, right? And so we can't do the math beyond two. We're just like, that's it, right? You poli-sci people are all like
More
thoughts.
factors.
Yeah,
right?
you're like, there's things that matter, and we're like, no, it's capital and labor, right? So whenever you have more people, you're going to have more output. That's just true. Almost no one in the world is a zero marginal product worker, which means that they produce literally nothing, right? Everyone produces something. The challenge, of course, is matching them and finding their opportunity to be productive. But bringing in more immigrants does not steal opportunities from Americans.
We're in agreement on that point.
Yeah, I also point out that immigrants are a major part of the construction workforce and the agricultural workforce. And so if you don't have the labor to pick crops, as is happening out in California, then you have less supply.
Or build houses. I mean, there's a huge crisis looming here in Michigan and in West Michigan around agricultural workers and construction workers. We've been talking about building more housing. There are not the people available to do that as we deport many of the people who did our construction for us.
I spent virtually all of my professional life working in the nonprofit sector here in Greater Grand Rapids, and I'm very grateful for how we were able to integrate public sector initiatives, public financing vehicles, and private initiatives. So I resonated when I heard you talk about, let's ask questions about the middleman. Let's see if we can't keep resources here local and find local solutions. All about that. That's great. But then I start remembering that ours is a very individualistic society. I mean, we can go back 150 years and take a look at the pioneer spirit. We can talk about rugged individualism. And now we can talk about political leadership that vilifies low-income people and minority people and immigrants. Then comes the tax policy. Hey, I got my own, let them get theirs. In other words, none of us wants to pay taxes. I'm interested, this is not an economic question. I don't know if it's a philosophical question, a political question, but how can we really build an ethos of local ownership, local investment, having to accept the reality that these issues are ours and we can't sit still for vilification for those who do face these challenges. That's the biggest issue that I see.
That's a really hard question. And I would say Grand Rapids is a fascinating place, really, because Grand Rapids, as you mentioned, it's a place with a lot of philanthropy. It's a place that's found a way to bring in public money to help support projects that, arguably improve the quality of life for most everyone. But it's a city. So I don't live here. I live in Kalamazoo. We're different. But it's a city where there's a lot of collaboration here, a lot of very intentional collaboration across sectors. And one thing that Grand Rapids has going for it is a very forward-looking business sector that understands that you can't just maximize profits in the short term. You have to actually pay attention to, say, the quality of education, K through 12 education, pre-K, because those people are the workers of the future. And I think that's partly because there are still industries here that are, multi-generationally family owned. So I feel like those are things that could be worked on in Grand Rapids because you do have this kind of cross-sector cooperative ethos. Of course, there are parts of Grand Rapids that are booming and parts that are neglected. And in a city that is growing in population and in economic wealth and in amenities, kind of leaving people out seems extra sad. This is not a distressed place, but it's a place that has some distressed areas. But the potential to try to bring those distressed parts of town into the kind of rising tide lifts all boats thing you got going on here, we hope.
So I would say this. I would push back on that we are an individualistic society. And I think we're not. I think within our local communities, we're very much a community. Think about your immediate circle. Okay, so I'm going to reference the great man on my tie, Adam Smith. Okay, Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. People often forget that he also wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments before that. He was already world famous for that book when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And in those two books, he describes two distinct sort of levels of behavior and activity. One is sort of the local, immediate level, and one is sort of the macro or like larger level. Okay, so I'm an economist. I love prices. I think they're great, right? I actually think we should have more prices and prices should adjust and be free to move however they need to. But I don't charge my 6-year-old rent. Why? Because he has no money, right? No, that's not why. Right? And I certainly don't have him bid on chores against his sister to see who gets the cookie at dinner. Right? I know my kids, and I know who has sort of earned the cookie, or here's the crazy thing, I can break the cookie in half. Right? Okay, so I know a lot about my family, and I can take care of them without having to charge them prices. I know a lot about my neighbors. So my neighbor Paul across the street, he's 68 years old. He's injured. He likes to go to the library every day. Guess who drives him at 9 o'clock in the morning? Me. Guess who picks him up at 5 o'clock and brings him home? Me. Why do I do that? Because I know Paul. Now here's the thing. When you know people, you can act meaningfully charitably toward them. And by meaningfully charitably, I mean you can act charitably toward them in a way that is dignifying, in a way that is giving them a hand up rather than just a hand out that they qualify for because they wrote something down on a piece of paper. When we try to expand that, though, beyond our immediate sphere, our immediate familial relationships, that's where things break down. That's where the mismatches come in. That's where the mandates, where the requirements, where the qualifying things, where the office that's just a couple miles down the road says, hey, we'll help you fill out the paperwork to qualify for all these special programs. That's where that comes from, the dispassionate thing. And charity to me, or helping people, is about being passionate. Knowing the person you're helping. That's why I'm so passionate about the local level here. Those people know you. They're willing to help you. You have to let them, which means you have to humble yourself a little bit and ask for the help when you need it, but you can do it. And that's what I think is the most beautiful thing about the United States. Not our economy, it's our people.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't jump here and say that part of the reason why the Hauenstein Center exists is so that we can gather together in these spaces, have these conversations, have the dialogue. We're still working really hard to get everyone to leave their homes post-pandemic because we all learned how to be at home by ourselves with our technology. And part of why we do this, and part of why I applaud all of you every time we get together, is because it takes effort. It takes some unlearning of what we recently went through together to get out, to put on real people clothes, to leave the house after it gets dark outside, and to sit next to someone who may not agree with what we think and what we believe and what we've sort of built around ourselves in terms of how we see ourselves and see others in our immediate circles. And so we talk a lot about the great content that we get here, but a big win for us at the Counseling Center is that you all come out and you do this together. So thank you for that. And hopefully we would like to believe that we're also, making a small step in that way together.
Also, thank you for doing this. I think human-to-human interaction is so important, and so I'm a big believer in, public institutions that do that, whether it's public schools or libraries or even just businesses having a sense of caring for the community. One thing I worry about in sort of politics and political dialogue is that social media algorithms tend to reward outrage and things that stoke outrage, whether they're fact-based or just misinformation-based. And I think when people come together and see people face to face, they realize that people who might be different because they come from a different socioeconomic strata, socioeconomic class, or they come from a different country or a different place, that we actually have a lot in common.
Michigan is one of 11 states that decided to organize itself on the New York model, meaning that it's very decentralized. We have 1,242 townships. We have 583 cities and villages, all of which have land use authority, including adopting and administering planning and zoning ordinances. My question is, if you compare Michigan to other states where most of the land use planning is centralized either in the county and the city, or in some cases the state, what kind of factor could you put on the cost of being so decentralized? How might affordability improve if we weren't so decentralized?
I want to say something about this, although I can't put a number on it. I grew up in California. I went to a school district that has 600,000 students in it, Los Angeles Unified School District. I live in Kalamazoo. In our county of 250,000 people, we have 9 school districts, 9 busing systems, 9 superintendents, 9 food service operations, et cetera, right? So that is not efficient. And Michigan's what some urbanists call like little box problem, where you can move in a mile in any direction and get into a different school district, maybe a different set of property taxes. I'm still stunned by it. The fact that we have universities and colleges that we don't have a system, we don't have a university system. We don't even have a community college system. It's every institution for themselves. They go to the legislature and lobby for their annual grant, set their tuition by themselves, have their own boards. I mean, it's nuts. What can be done about it? They're also a really difficult question. I mean, there have been efforts in the past at very simple level to merge school districts to save money on food services, or even, merge school districts, but nobody wants to give up their mascot or their football team. So, it's our culture here, and those efforts to create larger units of government that would undoubtedly be more efficient, would undoubtedly save money, would undoubtedly simplify things like land use. I'm not putting money on those happening. If anyone else wants to weigh in on the cost of decentralization.
Well, I'll push back. I don't think it's clear at all that if you have a larger government unit, there would be savings. I can imagine a scenario where that's true. But to me, it's certainly the case that having more units and more granular decision-making will slow things down. The challenge I would push back on is that always a bad thing? And I think the answer to that is no. Because if you think about it, who understands what the land near you should be used for better than you and your neighbors? That seems to be true. Now, if someone in Lansing showed me a report that said, hey, Dave, the best use for your property is actually not to build your house on it. It's to put a gas station. I would get pretty upset. There's a reason why eminent domain cases get a lot of thorny issues, and the person whose domain was eminently seized is never quite happy. And so I would push back and say, I can imagine a scenario where if men were angels, then a larger government unit would be more efficient. But we know men are not angels. And I don't mean men as in like males. I mean all people. Yeah, it's the
Yeah, and
Federalist
I don't want to
51.
go all in on the land use issue. My
Right.
background is more in education, and I think it's been it's really facilitated segregation, racial and economic segregation, and really made it difficult to sustain strong, vital, diverse, mixed income level school districts. Michigan's little box system of government is also what sits behind the intense decline of Detroit in terms of population and wealth. Coming back a little bit, but Detroit is less than half the size that it was, and that's only because it's really easy to get out. You just can move to one of those suburbs. So I think there are a lot of dysfunctions and inequality issues that come from our municipal system of government. It's something I always used to drive my students crazy talking about. Let's talk about municipal jurisdictions now. But they're super important here, and I don't know that they're going to change. But I think it's a really important concept to help people understand some of the dynamics you see. That's why you see so many school districts, et cetera.
As we wrap up today, in the spirit of common ground, we're going to give each of you a chance to say some parting words. But when you go away from here and your friends or your family say, hey, how'd that panel go? What are you going to say to them about where you heard the most agreement and or maybe the biggest differences among the conversation today? And Dave, we'll start with you, and then Michelle, and we'll let Emily finish.
Yeah, so what's encouraging to me, and I think this is just true, it's actually just confirming things that I already know and that you all know as well. Show me the person in the United States that is literally against making housing more affordable. Show me the person that has actively said, I want food to be less affordable, that I want education to be more expensive. That person doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist on this panel either. And it doesn't exist in this room, I suspect. The reason why it doesn't exist is because nobody's against affordability. Nobody wants people to have to go without things that they need. The challenge, of course, is that we all have different visions of how to get to that land that we want to go to, where everyone has access and equal access and equitable access. We differ on how to get there. We don't differ on where to go. And I think that if we can realize that even Donald Trump and even Bernie Sanders, at least I suspect, both want the same thing, which is to improve the country, to make people healthier, wealthier, however they choose to define those terms. They just differ on how to get from where we are to where we want to go. If we can understand that the people you're talking to, if you disagree with them, there is a common ground on what we're trying to accomplish. We just differ on the means.
Good use of the term common ground.
I know, right?
Bonus points. I really often find it stressful to be on panels with people that I kind of like potentially disagree with. So I really enjoyed this. It was less stressful than I expected it would be. I think we do differ strongly on the role of the federal government, particularly as a kind of an equalizing function. But I'm pleased to say I'm a big believer that a lot can be done at the state and local level, as are my co-panelists. And so it's nice because the kind of political polarization we see like in Congress right now, you don't really see that at the state and local level. There's just much more scope for what I think about as like nonpartisan solutions at the local level and bipartisan solutions. Michigan has made massive investments in education. They've done it under a Democratic, then Republican, then Democratic governor with a Democratic, Republican, and Democratic legislature. So these are not necessarily partisan issues, and there's a lot that can be done, but the federal government's really important. So yes.
Thank you.
So I think for me, one commonality among us, as well as some of the questions I heard from the audience, is taking these affordability questions seriously, particularly on housing, on healthcare, and wanting to look for solutions that are grounded in evidence and data and numbers, and keeping those numbers and the sources for them well-funded and resourced. I think we probably have differing views on the role of the federal government and the role of government and policy in solving these problems, but I do agree that and like that there's a spirit of that we need to be helping our neighbors, our literal neighbors, but also sort of each other's in society. I think Dave may have more more faith in philanthropy to be the backstop for that than I think a bit more as a complement to what we owe as a society in a social compact through tax dollars. But I do think caring for each other is a really important part of having a good society, but also moving forward.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to say on behalf of the audience and myself tonight, we want to thank you all for really great information and a great conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. To the folks who came out tonight, thank you so much. For those who are joining us from home, online, or wherever you are, thank you for being a part of this conversation. We certainly hope you learned something. We hope you were challenged by something new. And we can't wait to see you again at our future events. Next up is March 19 with a program called The Lecture about the impact that women running for office have on young people. And from here on out, we just invite you to enjoy some refreshments in the exhibition hall and have a great night. Thanks.
Thank you.